Hi guys, my name is Yuri, and in this video we're going to follow up on the last video, and we're going to go ahead and look at some of the treatment that you might expect using a content management system when you were talking about treating CSS files. And we're going to do this in the context of the Datafirm website. So the Datafirm website that was put together for a course, a capstone project from a course, from a 2015 course. And once again, I showed you guys that video or that website in the last video. So let's go ahead and turn on the server again. We'll launch the server and also go to the localhost and have a look at the Datafirm website. So we're going to talk about, let's put together kind of a little itinerary of what we want to talk about in this video. And we're talking about CSS and SCSS, and we are talking about implementing CSS and SCSS in content management systems. And so one of the things that we are going to find is that in a content management system, every content management system is going to treat CSS files in a similar way, using different, we can call it machinery. I'm actually going to call it code. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to check the URL for that code. It's going to check the URL, and ultimately it's going to figure out which page the website is on. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to gather the CSS and bring that gather the CSS or the SCSS, and it's going to process it. And we're going to see some ways in which it processes the CSS. So one of the first things that we're going to see is we're going to see some resource processing, and that's going to be converting, we will actually say compiling SCSS to CSS. We're also going to see some other types of processing that we might see. We might need some post-CSS processing. We might see some fingerprinting. We might see mapping. We might see various methodologies that are going to be applied to processing the CSS and the SCSS. And you would see, of course, if we were talking about other resources like JavaScript, you would see some processing as well. So we might talk about unification as well. And now we're going to see, once we have gathered and processed the CSS, or possibly before we've gathered and processed the CSS, we are going to be splitting that CSS up. So we're going to be splitting the SCSS or the CSS, SCSS or CSS. We're going to be splitting this into critical CSS and non-critical CSS, and that's something that we're going to see again and again in every content management system in some form or another. You may want to have this may be added through the functionality of a plugin. It may be included in the context of a theme, but when you're talking about web design and you're talking about using a content management system, you're typically going to be talking about splitting your SCSS or your CSS into critical and non-critical SCSS. And the next step, of course, is that you're going to be actually inserting the CSS. So of course you're going to insert the critical CSS is going to be inserted inline, and you're going to insert the non-critical CSS is going to be inserted. It's actually going to be deferred. It will be deferred and loaded afterwards. So this is the process of managing splitting the CSS into critical and non-critical. We're going to see something else, and that is going to be treatment of external CSS files, so styling files. So we would be talking about Bootstrap. We might be talking about Tailwind. So these are some other treatments. Of course, there are also other libraries for dealing with CSS, CSS. So there may be a lot of customized CSS in the context of the different libraries, packages, and plugins that you're bringing into the website, so into the content management system. And ultimately, you're going to want to be treating the CSS for those different libraries in a similar way. So you're going to be processing that CSS. You're going to be splitting that CSS into critical CSS and non-critical CSS. And you're going to be treating the CSS within the process of your processing pipeline in a similar way. So we're just going to go ahead and have a look at how this is implemented within the context of the Datafirm website. So when we go to the Datafirm website, we will have a look at how that is played out in the context of the Datafirm website. And to do that, let's just have a look at the index file, and we can see how the index file is called. So this would be the WordPress cycle. The WordPress cycle would be running here, kind of running. It would introduce some variables, it would load some functions, it would run through a WordPress loop, it would determine what page is on, and then there would be all kinds of opportunities for filters and hooks and other actions to be introduced within the context of WordPress. If this were a WordPress content management system, this is just some straight PHP code, so I'm just going to look at how we achieve similar objectives, similar functions within the context of this PHP code. And the way that it does that is it loads some functions, it loads some variables, initializes some variables. There's a small page configuration, and then there is the head file. So when we're talking about a head file, we're really talking about, and we're just going to take a look at an example of how this might look in the context of an HTML template. So you can see in the context of an HTML template, we're looking at this head section. So this is the section where it is going to be a lot of processing of code is going to occur within the head tag for your website on every page, and there's going to be a lot of code within the content management system. It's going to be introducing a lot of links, a lot of tags, and a lot of introducing scripts, inlining scripts, and other various, for example, bringing in favicons. There's a lot that's going to happen in the context of the head tag. That's a pretty important part of any content management systems. There's going to be a fair amount of code that's just going to be dealt with in between these two tags. And that's what we're going to take a look at in the context of this PHP document here. So I'm just going to remove that placeholder, and we'll just close out from that file, and we'll go directly into this head PHP. We'll have a look at it. And actually, now in this content management system, we have a backup PHP, and our processing pipeline is actually processing the backup PHP and producing this file here, which is why we have the compressed.php file there. So you can see that the backup.php is something that we can relate to. We can work on it. We can look at it, how it's working. The first thing we see is that it introduces a switch developer.php. And we also have, I guess, a switch production.php. So based on which website we're using, we might have a different include file. And there's probably the switch developer. If we look in here, it's probably switch production. You can see it's switch production. So this code is processing it and switching that. That's something that you would see in the context of your content management system. It would be doing something similar. It would be processing the code and the website for the local host, for the in the development server context, and also within the context of the production server. So we're going to look into the backup file here, and we can see the first thing it does is it opens up this switch code, and then it introduces the HTML code. Within the context of the HTML code, we can see that it's introducing a style sheet here. Now this might be deferred. Typically, you may have many style sheets, and there is likely to be some inline CSS here as well. So we're looking at how the CSS is treated. You can see that the PHP is actually echoing out the path, which is a pretty standard treatment that you're going to see in pretty much every content management, every type of language. For example, if the website is built on a Node backend, then you're going to see Node doing the same thing. It's going to be ultimately writing the path for the PHP is going to be written, or for the JavaScript is going to directly write the JavaScript into the HTML. And you may see something different in the context of different websites. You might, or different content management systems, you might see some quotations on the outside here, and then you would just have some straight code in here, especially if you were processing that link in some way to ensure that it was protected, or it had some or the protocol was correct. So you might have an HTTPS protocol, a secure protocol, or you might have both protocols, or you might have some different ways of processing it. So what we're seeing in the context of this website is we're just seeing some PHP, and it's just introducing a variable called ActivePage .css. So we can actually bring that out, have a look at that, and we can see also we have some Jquery here, which is not very nice to have in a website in my opinion, but again, this is a website from 2015, so I'm not a fan of Jquery. Of course, the reason is that Jquery is a really big library. You might not always be using all of the Jquery when you are constructing your code. So it's, in my opinion, it's better not to use the Jquery at all. And WordPress still does use a Jquery. I think there are ways of loading Jquery in a way that allows you to get high scores on your Lighthouse score in terms of improving the efficiency of the website, the speed that the website loads. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the JavaScript. You can see the JavaScript is following. We have two JavaScripts here, and you can see that the JavaScripts are following basically the same process that we have when we're looking at the CSS. So we'll just go ahead and see JavaScript. You can see it's echoing out a variable, and that variable of course has a path in it. So in this case the JavaScript is deferred, so again we would expect with the context of the JavaScript that we would have some inline JavaScript as well. The above the fold JavaScript would be inline. So here we are seeing once again, and there's something else that we can see here, and that is the use of these dots. This dot variable is coming out of the functions, and this is a variable that changes the depth of the path, essentially based on the whether it's the server is a local host or a production server. So this is one way of achieving that objective, which every content management system is going to ultimately achieve that objective. So what we're going to do next is we can bring this out. We can take a look at this, and we can take a look at the switch developer. So this is the code that loads immediately at the top of this file, and then we have the head tag, and then we're running some other code. We have some slim code here. This code would be quite a lot larger. There would be quite a lot more code if this was a more developed content management system, but there's really not much to it here. And we can look at another time at how you can have image stacks, processing stacks for your images. There are many different types of variables. We'll be processing this description code here, extracting different types of variables out of the description and inserting them. Of course, there's a lot that goes on in the context of a content management system that we're not seeing in this content management system, simply based on the length of the course. So we can go ahead and have a look at what we are doing with this switch developer. So there's quite a lot of code that goes on. Well, it's actually quite a simple selection of code, but it is checking to see if there's a session started, and that is because the website as we may have mentioned, has surveys. So that survey uses session variables so that when you go through the entries in the survey, if you return to questions in the survey that were answered, those questions are retained. The login is also retained. Information is retained within the context of session variables. So this website uses session variables, so it is checking to see if the session is active. Now these three variables right here are, here we have some more initialization of variables, and here we are looking at the file extension, we have the path info, and we also have the path without the file extension. So that is the path and the file extension, so or without the file extension. So we can go ahead and look at how this content management system, this mimicry of a content management system, this, I should say, example of a content management system is going to achieve this first objective. It's going to check the URL, it's going to figure out which page the website is on, and it's going to gather the CSS or SCSS and process it. So it is doing that right here, and it's gathering the URL of the extension and the file, and then it's checking to see if the session is active or if it isn't active. And based on we have a switch statement, and we're really looking at the file equals surveys. We have, if this is a surveys page, it is going to run this code, and we are going to see this code here. Else we have a switch statement, which is just going to take the base name. So ultimately we're looking at this page variable. We have the dots that are being included here, and everything is being loaded into a case variable, and we're actually in a switch, which is also includes this case. Just keep in mind that this case in this case are two different cases. This is an array, and this is part of this switch. And so what we're looking for is, here we're extracting from the case array the CSS, and that is going to the active page SCSS. So everything up here is producing the case CSS. You can see that we have the depth, whether it's a local host or whether it's a production server, and we have the repository of the directory, it's the CSS directory, and we have ultimately the page. The page is the file, and the file itself is what we extracted up here. So we can see here that we checked for the base name, and this gives the file without the extension. So that should mean that when we are looking at the case.css, it's probably adding an extension on the end, and we'll see that it actually is adding an extension on the end. So we can go ahead and we can look at this, and that is how it is achieving out which the page is on. And it's actually inserting the CSS, and we could add, in this case, it's inserting CSS specific to your page. So and let's go ahead and turn this off. So you can see that we are inserting CSS on the page, and so that's how ultimately we are achieving the objective of having unique CSS files for every page. So when we go to the website and look, the CSS file for this page is of course unique, and the CSS file for this page is also unique. So these CSS files are, this is how we are achieving the result. We are basically styling each page differently, and that's because the code in the content management system is determining which page it is, and it's serving up a CSS file specifically for that page. Now, every single content management system is going to follow the same process. So as we go back to this system here, we can see one thing we haven't done is we didn't split the CSS or insert the CSS into critical and non-critical deferred CSS. However, we did discuss that. So we did mention that at this point here, if we were inserting this, we would have some CSS that would be inserted directly inlined, and then we would also have some JavaScript that would be directly inlined. So we go ahead, we can see we achieve that. Well, we haven't looked at the processing pipeline, the resource processing. So we're just going to take a look at how that plays out, and we're just going to talk about the treatment of the external CSS files. So any external CSS files are of course likely to be deferred, and you can see in the context of this content management system, they are not deferred. So what you would likely be doing in this case, here we have the Jquery, and you can also see that these Jquery libraries are doubled up in this particular project. So this is actually incorrect because we are serving this twice. This might be, for example, something you could remove this, and you could remove this as well. So this looks like it was still some development code that was used, and we're actually serving the two versions. We have the same versions, but we are actually serving it up 2 times. So what we would be looking at doing here is definitely adding defer. And what we would be doing is we would be extracting from this file any relevant Jquery that was required for the above the fold CSS. So this is the above the fold CSS, and we would likely, if we were to use Jquery in here, it would be used here likely, and it would also be used here in the context of our JavaScript files. So we would have some JavaScript that was using the Jquery. This would be actually in the JavaScript files. I'm not going to worry about that right now, but just keep in mind that these scripts would ultimately be deferred. And in a content management system, it's going to be a much more elaborate process for including these scripts into the website itself. So we don't really need to worry about this because this is not a content management system. It's a capstone project from a website. But as you can see, we would want to be treating these external libraries. In this case, they're JavaScript libraries. However, I think we're actually discussing CSS libraries here when we're talking about Bootstrap and Tailwind. So we don't even see any Bootstrap, which is, in my opinion, a good thing. A Bootstrap can be really helpful, but of course it defeats the purpose of separating your structure from your styling. So when you are talking about Bootstrap, you are typically talking about introducing styling directly into structure. And that means that if you have a really large website, and let's say you decided to introduce some margins in your structure, and then you wanted to go ahead and change your margins on every page. If you had 1,000 pages, you would have to manually go to every page and change the margins, or you would have to change the Bootstrap itself, which isn't the purpose of Bootstrap. And of course, Tailwind and Bootstrap are really good if you have websites that don't have a large footprint and you just want to produce a brochure site, for example. You might be using Bootstrap. But when you are building out an application, or ideally you would like to have a really large footprint for your website, then of course you're going to be avoiding using libraries, styling libraries that are merging styling and structure. This defeats the purpose of the orthogonality of separating styling directly from structure. But however, in the context of a website that is using Bootstrap or Tailwind, you're still going to be looking at splitting out the critical CSS and inlining it from the non-critical deferred CSS, which can be another challenge when you're using these libraries, which is another reason why I wouldn't recommend using these libraries. I would just recommend using this SCSS. So we're going to go back to, we're going to return to this directory, and we'll just take a look at how this processing is working. Now, in the context of a content management system, you might see this processing directly in the code base. This is the case with Hugo. In the Hugo code, this processing is built directly into the code, and it's not something that we're introducing externally. In the context of this website, we are using the Node system. for creating our processing pipeline. So here we're looking at the auto prefixer, the HTML minifier, and the node Sass, and the post CSS and uglifying. We're actually running some of this code after we have processed the website. So we're processing a website, and we are specifically serving some compressed pages. So we're manually compressing those pages using the node pipeline. So node pipeline is compressing the pages that we're serving, and we're doing that after we create those pages. So that's why when we go into the directory, when we return to the directory, you can see that this index.php is compressed. Well, this index main HTML is compressed. And the reason that this is compressed is because we have run it through a processing pipeline. And that is using this node processing stack. So here we're talking about, we also have a watch system in here, and an on-change system. So what that's doing is it is watching the change of the Sass files using node Sass. And when those Sass files changes, the Sass is processed automatically, and it changes the CSS files that are in this CSS directory. So when we close this out, we just change that. When we close this out and we see the CSS files, every time the Sass files are changed, it's going to update automatically these CSS files. And if we have a program that is watching the server, that's refreshing the server, like live reload, we could, for example, change the color of this styling, and we're going to see that directly on the local host. So that's how we can manage web development without having to refresh every time you have an external program. You can get them to the browser. You can build them into your node pipeline, to your node processing stack. You can also, of course, a lot of content management systems are going to have those just built directly into the content management systems. That's going to rapidly improve your ability to develop the website on a local host server. So when we go back to this directory, you can see that we have some Sass files, and these Sass files, if we are working in one of these Sass files, let's split the screen and we can take a look at, let's say, this expertise file, and you can see again that we have the orthogonality. So we are going to be looking at some let's just take a look in here. So we have expertise, and let's take a look at the blogs SCSS file as well. So you can see that these two files are using the same includes. We're using the reset, we're using the variables, we're using the media queries, we're using the base. And if we were inlining some of this, we would have, for example, some more files. We would have the files that were being inlined, and then we would have the files that were being deferred. So that's how we would be able to separate those out. And essentially what this is, these are all includes. This is giving us the ability to streamline our files. So we have components for SCSS that we're using. You can see we have some SCSS media queries, and you can see that we have some grid files, and you can also see that every file has some SCSS at the top of the file, and that is just a precaution for any of these files that only contain CSS. So if the file only contains CSS, the SCSS processor won't process it. So we've introduced a CS or SCSS variable initialization at the top of every file, just in case we have a file that doesn't use any SCSS in it. And keep in mind, of course, when you are processing this is all on the developer side. The actual files that are being deployed are static CSS files, so that code is not going to be running, so it's not going to have any effect on the speed of the website, for example. So you can see here we have this SCSS grid, and there are we're taking advantage of some of the some of the value of using SCSS. For example, we have some nested includes, we have some responsive includes. We might find throughout these files, we might find some mix-ins, we might find some other aspects of SCSS, probably going to find some other advantages of using SCSS, which is ultimately why we use SCSS and not CSS. So we're using SCSS to produce our CSS files, and that is again in the part of this processing stack. Now, keeping in mind that our minification, these files are not fingerprinted, but our fingerprinting and minification and our post-CSS processing in this case is all being done by the package.json. So the package.json is running that processing stack, and ultimately, if we wanted to introduce fingerprinting, we would probably do that here. We would, for example, run a shell, and in the shell, we would do npm, and we would do install, and then we would search for that fingerprinting package. So we could go ahead and have a look at this on Google. We could see that there actually is fingerprinting with npm. So you can see that this is ultimately how you would introduce that fingerprinting. This would be the more modern way of introducing the fingerprinting in a Node application. This comes with the map option. You can set the map option to true. You want to have that map option. In the context of this content management system, we would just be installing that and just using it as a Node script. So we're not using it as a Node development package in the context of a Node script. We're using npm. We're importing npm Node scripts via the package manager, introducing those dependencies via the package.json processing system. So that is how we are achieving the mapping, fingerprinting, and ultimately the minifications through the Node pipeline. Now, these would be obviously introduced in the context of your content management system. So your content management system would be doing that processing. And so that gives you an idea of how we're dealing with styling files in the context of your content management system. And that is something to think about when you are developing for any different content management system. So for example, if you're developing for a Shopify system, a Wix system, a Squarespace system, any system, you're going to be treating your CSS files, your JavaScript files, your images, you're going to be treating them in a similar way. It's going to be independent from the content management system. So thanks so much for watching, and we're looking forward to seeing you guys next time. Bye.